What happens when the woman your family threw away comes back, not crawling, not begging, not broken, but standing at the entrance of a ballroom with a man whose name makes boardrooms go silent? Kezia Thornton spent 12 years building a life from scratch after the people who were supposed to love her chose a lie over her. They believed the stepmother. They believed the whispers. They let her walk out with nothing but her dignity and the quiet knowledge that she had never done what they accused her of. She didn't come back to prove anything. She came back because her father asked her to. And because, for the first time in a long time, she had nothing left to fear. The man standing beside her. He didn't need an introduction, but he was about to give one anyway. This is the story of what happens when silence finally breaks, and the truth decides it's done waiting. If you're here for stories that make you feel everything, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a single one. And drop a comment below. Have you ever had to walk back into a room full of people who wrote you off? Tell me your story. I read every single one. There are things you don't forget. Not because you're weak, but because some things carve themselves into you so deep that they become part of the architecture of who you are. They stop being memories and start being walls, foundations. The reason you stand a certain way. Kezia Thornton knew exactly where her walls came from. Her mother, Adizi, had died on a Tuesday in October of 2002, when Kezia was 12 years old, and the world still felt like a place that made sense. Adiz Thornton had been a woman of extraordinary warmth, the kind of warmth that fills a house the way music does, not loudly, but everywhere at once. She taught Kezia how to make jollof rice from scratch. She read to her every night, until Kezia was old enough to think she was too old to be read to, and then secretly missed it. She told her daughter, with a certainty that never wavered, that she was brilliant and worthy, and that the world would eventually recognize it. When she died, a stroke, sudden, no warning, the warmth went out of the house like a switch had been flipped. Her father, Gerald Thornton, was a decent man, a quiet man. A man who grieved in the particular way that some people grieve, by filling the silence as fast as possible, because silence is where the loss lives. He threw himself into his architecture firm. He came home late. He looked at Kezia sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read until she was older and understood. She looked too much like her mother, and it cost him something to see her. 2 years after Adaisy's death, when Kezia was 14, Gerald Thornton married Sandra. Sandra Whitmore Thornton arrived in their Chicago home in the spring of 2004, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes when it was directed at Kezia. She was organized, polished, relentlessly social, and she had 2 children of her own from a previous marriage. Marcus, who was 17 and largely indifferent to Kezia's existence, and Diane, who was 15 and made it her personal mission to establish the hierarchy as quickly as possible. Sandra never raised her voice at Kezia. That was the thing about her. She was too smart for that. She worked in a register of subtle corrections, loaded silences, and gentle redirections that were only visible if you were the one they were aimed at. She rearranged the photos in the living room, and somehow, without ever announcing it, the photos of Adaisy ended up in a box in the attic. She redecorated the kitchen Adaisy had loved. She told Gerald that Kezia's grief counselor was probably making things worse, and that what the girl needed was structure, not analysis. Kezia stopped going to grief counseling when she was 15. She learned, instead, to be small, quiet, to make herself easy to overlook, because the alternative was being the focus of Sandra's particular brand of management. She threw herself into school with the energy of someone who understood that grades were a door that led somewhere else. She was methodical, disciplined, and furious in the quiet way that only very smart people can be, channeling everything into becoming someone who would not need anyone in that house to open a single door for her. She got a full scholarship to Northwestern at 18. She packed her things in 2 bags and did not cry until she was on the highway, and even then, it was not entirely sadness. It was relief, complicated and guilty, because relief felt like a betrayal of the girl she'd been, the one who'd wanted so badly to belong in that house. She came home for holidays. She maintained a careful, functional relationship with her father, who she loved and who she believed loved her back. Even if they had both learned to speak to each other across a distance that had grown so gradually they'd stopped noticing it. She was polite to Sandra. She was cordial to Marcus and Diane. She managed it for years. Until 2012. Kezia was 22 years old and in her second year of a master's program in communications at Northwestern when Marcus got engaged. His fiancée was a woman named Priya. Warm, genuine. Someone Kezia had actually liked on the 2 occasions she'd met her. Marcus was 25 and seemed, for the first time since Kezia had known him, genuinely happy. Even their relationship, never close, always polite, had thawed slightly. They'd texted occasionally. He'd asked her once for advice on a gift for Priya. It had felt like the beginning of something. Then Priya ended the engagement, abruptly, without a public explanation. The family convened at the Thornton house that weekend. Kezia drove down from Evanston, aware that something was wrong, but not yet knowing that she was, according to Sandra, the reason for it. The story Sandra told was clean and specific, which was always the most dangerous kind of lie. She said that Kezia had contacted Priya privately. She claimed she had receipts, screenshots, messages, and had told her that Marcus had a history of emotional abuse, that he had treated a previous girlfriend so badly that the girl had needed therapy, and that Priya deserved to know before she married into this family. Sandra's voice was measured and heartbroken as she recounted it. She said she hadn't wanted to believe it. She said she'd been up all night. Gerald Thornton looked at his daughter across the living room and asked, with the particular exhaustion of a man who had already decided he was going to believe what was easier, whether it was true. Kezia said it wasn't. She said she had never contacted Priya. She said she had never sent those messages. She asked to see the screenshots. Sandra said the screenshots were private, that she'd already shared them with Priya, and that was the only thing that mattered. Marcus stared at Kezia with a look she had never seen on anyone's face before. Something between grief and contempt. Diane sat very still and said nothing, which told Kezia everything about whether Diane had known before that meeting. Nobody asked to verify anything. Nobody suggested that a story should need more than one source. 12 years of Sandra's patient, relentless work had done its job. Kezia was already, in this household, the variable, the disruption, the complicated one. Her father told her, very quietly, that perhaps it would be best if she didn't come home for a while. Until things settled. Until Marcus had time to grieve what he'd lost. Kezia picked up her bag and walked out of the house. She was 22 years old, and she did not slam the door, because she had inherited her mother's understanding that the loudest statement is often the quietest exit. She drove back to Evanston. She sat in her apartment for a long time. Then she made herself dinner, opened her research notes, and kept working, because the work was the thing nobody could take away. The engagement, she would learn years later through mutual acquaintances, had ended because Priya had heard something, not from Kezia, never from Kezia, but from a source within the family. The exact nature of what Priya had been told remained opaque. What was clear was that the messages Sandra claimed to possess had never been produced. Not then, not ever. Because they didn't exist. There was nothing to produce. But an accusation doesn't need to be proven to do its work. It only needs to be believed. And Sandra had spent 8 years making sure she was the one who got believed. Kezia finished her master's degree. She moved to New York. She spent 3 years at a media communications firm, where she was relentless and careful and brilliant. The way she had always been, the way she had learned to be. She was promoted twice in 2 years. She started consulting independently on the side. Brand strategy, corporate communication, crisis management, because it turned out that growing up in a house with Sandra Whitmore Thornton was an education in how narratives get constructed and destroyed. And Kezia had decided to understand that education completely so she could use it for something other than surviving it. She made friends who became family. She traveled. She built a life that felt like hers, in a way that the Chicago house had never felt like hers. Full, specific, chosen. She heard from her father occasionally, a birthday call, a text at Christmas. Their conversations had the particular texture of two people who love each other and have no idea how to cross the distance that grew between them. Gerald Thornton was not a cruel man. He was a man who had made a choice and hadn't known how to unmake it, and now lived quietly with the consequences. Kezia forgave him for this in increments, over years, in the private way that forgiveness sometimes happens. Not announced, not dramatic, just a gradual loosening of the tightness around something that used to hurt. She met Woo Jin-yoon in 2018. She had been brought in to consult on a communications crisis for a mid-sized tech firm in Manhattan, and he was in the building for a completely different meeting, something involving a potential acquisition that would have bored her to tears, but that he appeared to find genuinely interesting, which she noted, because in her experience, the people who found genuinely interesting things, genuinely interesting, were a specific kind of person. They met in the elevator. He held the door. She thanked him. He said something dry and accurate about the building's lobby art that made her laugh out loud before she'd decided to, and she looked at him with the expression she wore when something surprised her. Slightly narrowed eyes, a pause, a recalibration. They had coffee that afternoon. They talked for 4 hours. She missed her train back to her office and didn't care even a little. What she hadn't anticipated about Woo Jin, what continued to catch her by surprise even years into their relationship, was the quality of his attention. She had dated people before who were charming, who were smart, who were good at the performance of listening. Woo Jin wasn't performing. When he listened, he was actually there, actually following, actually storing things. And he would reference them weeks later in conversation in ways that made her feel, consistently, like she had been seen. It mattered more to her than she'd initially understood, because she had spent so many years being unseen in the specific way that happens when you're in a room full of people who have decided what you are. Who you are doesn't get much of a hearing after that. You become the version of yourself they've constructed, and you exhaust yourself either fighting it or accommodating it. Woo Jin had no prior version of her. He met exactly the person who showed up, and the person who showed up was fully herself in a way she was still growing accustomed to. And he received that person with a completeness that she had not experienced before and did not take for granted. He was not easy, in the sense that mattered. He challenged her. He was direct in ways that sometimes stung, and he had a perfectionism about his work that occasionally bled into a restlessness she'd had to learn to read, when to give him space and when to pull him back. They had fought, properly, twice in the first year. The kind of fights that go somewhere real and require something real to come back from. They came back. What they'd built on the other side of those fights had more structural integrity than anything built around them would have. She had told him about Sandra in increments, over months. Not as a way of seeking his opinion about it. She wasn't looking for someone to be outraged on her behalf. But because it was part of who she was, and he was someone she was letting know who she was. He had listened to all of it without rushing to fix it or frame it or offer counter-narrative. When she finished, the first time she told the full story in one sitting, he had been quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "She sounds like a person who needed you to be smaller than you are." Kezia had looked at him. She had thought about it. She had said, "Yes, exactly that." He'd nodded, like something had been confirmed. Then he'd asked if she wanted more coffee. That was Woo Jin. He could say the thing that cracked something open in you, and then give you room to be in the crack without making a whole production of it. She had fallen in love with him in about 40 different moments, each time a little deeper. Woo Jin-yoon was the kind of person who listened the way most people don't. He had grown up between Seoul and New York, son of a Korean industrialist family, and had built his own company separate from his family's business precisely because he needed to know that what he had was something he'd actually earned. She understood that impulse completely. They were together for 2 years before he proposed, in their apartment on a Sunday morning with coffee going cold on the counter and a ring he'd had made by a jeweler in Seoul who'd known his grandmother. And she said yes so quickly that he laughed and told her that was supposed to be a longer moment. They married in October 2020, on a rooftop in Manhattan with 40 of the people they actually wanted there, and nobody else. Kezia wore something her mother would have loved. She carried a photograph of Adaiz in her bouquet, She cried twice, once during the ceremony and once after, alone in a bathroom for 3 minutes, for the woman who should have been there. Her father attended. It was the first time she'd seen him in 2 years. He held her hand before she walked toward Woo Jin and said, in a voice that had aged in ways she hadn't been present to witness, that her mother would have been so proud. Kezia held on to those words and tucked them somewhere safe, because some things you need to be able to find again later. Sandra did not attend. There had been no invitation. The call came on a Wednesday evening in September 2024, when Kezia was 34 years old and sitting in their apartment with her laptop open and a glass of wine she'd been neglecting for an hour. It was her father, Gerald Thornton, who was 72 years old, and whose voice had continued to age in the particular way of men who hold things too long without putting them down, told her that Sandra was turning 70, that they were having a party, not a large one, he said, just family. He paused in that specific way of his, the pause that meant he was about to say the actual thing. And then he said that he would very much like it if she came. There was a longer silence on Kezia's end. Gerald filled it by saying that he was getting older, that there were things he should have said a long time ago, that he was not asking her to forgive Sandra or to pretend that nothing had happened, only to come, because she was his daughter and he missed her and he wanted her there. Kezia looked at the wine glass she'd been ignoring. She thought about her mother, and the house, and the afternoon she'd walked out of it at 22. She thought about all the versions of this conversation she'd rehearsed in her head over the years and then never had, because the call had never come, or she hadn't answered, or both. She told him she would think about it. She hung up and sat with it for a long moment. Then she got up, went to the kitchen where Woo Jin was reading something at the counter, and told him about the call. She told him all of it. Not just the invitation, but the history, the 2012 accusation, Sandra, the way the house had felt all those years, her father's particular brand of loving inadequacy. She told it the way she'd told it to him before, in pieces over years, but this time in full, all at once, because she needed to hear it herself in sequence. Woo Jin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. What did she want to do? Not what did she think she should do. Not what was the right call. What did she want? She said she wanted to go. Not for Sandra. For her father, who was 72 and had missed her wedding and was getting older in a way she could hear in his voice. And maybe, somewhere underneath that, for herself. To stand in that room as exactly who she was now, without apology, without the need for any of them to acknowledge a single thing. Woo Jin nodded. Then he said he'd clear his schedule. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that expression she knew, quiet, certain, a little amused. She wasn't going anywhere he wasn't going. That wasn't how they operated. She didn't argue. They flew into Chicago on a Friday evening, the city spreading beneath the plane in its particular grid of amber and white that always reminded her of a circuit board. Kezia had flown this route more times than she could count, for holidays she'd learned to manage, for her grandmother's funeral, for the wedding of a college friend who'd grown up in Evanston. But this approach felt different. The city below was not the city of her childhood exactly, because the city of her childhood had a version of herself in it that no longer existed, and going back was never quite going back, only going forward to the place where the past had been. She had barely slept the night before they left. Not from dread. She had been careful to examine that, to understand the difference between dread and the particular alertness that comes before something important. It was the latter. She lay awake in their hotel room for a while, the city quiet in the way it gets after 2 a.m, listening to Woo Jin breathe beside her and thinking about what she was walking into and why it felt, unexpectedly, more like completion than confrontation. She was not going back to fight. She had understood that clearly. She was not going back to present evidence or demand acknowledgement or perform her success for people who had doubted her. She was going back because her father was 72 and had called her with something true and careful in his voice, and because she had finally, at 34, accumulated enough of herself that walking into that house couldn't take any of it away. That was the thing that had changed. Not the circumstances. Not Sandra's character or Marcus's complications or Carol's particular brand of performed sympathy. What had changed was the person walking in. Wu Jin had stirred at some point. He had an uncanny sensitivity to her wakefulness, as though even in sleep some part of him remained attuned to her state. And he'd reached across without opening his eyes and rested his hand on her arm. Just that. She put her hand over his and eventually fell asleep. In the morning, she had packed with the efficiency of someone who had learned to travel light, and he had made coffee from the hotel machine and brought her a cup without being asked. And when she looked at him over it, he said, simply, that she was going to be fine. Not as reassurance, as observation, the way you'd tell someone that the weather looks clear. She had believed him. She believed him about most things. The party was held at the Thornton House in Lincoln Park on the second Saturday of October 2024. The house was the same house. Gerald had never sold it. Had never been the kind of man who made large changes easily. But it felt smaller than Kezia remembered. The way places always feel smaller when you've grown past the version of yourself that lived there. They arrived at 7 in the evening. Wu Jin drove because he always drove, a habit left over from the years when he'd moved through New York and the particular kind of privacy that came from not needing anyone else to navigate. He parked on the street, and they sat for a moment in the car, engine off, the amber light of Chicago autumn coming through the windows. Kezia was very still. Not nervous. She had been nervous once, about this house, about what the people inside it thought of her. She was not nervous now. She was something else. Composed. Present. Ready in the way you are when you've been carrying something for a long time and you finally decided what to do with it. Wu Jin reached across and covered her hand with his. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. After 6 years together, they had a language that didn't always require words, a vocabulary of small gestures and calibrated silences that communicated whole conversations. She turned her hand over and held his. 1 breath. 2. Then she opened the car door. The house was full when they walked in. Not crowded. Gerald had meant it when he said not large. But full of people Kezia recognized in the way you recognize people from a life you used to live. Cousins she hadn't spoken to in years. Neighbors she remembered as younger versions of themselves. 2 women who had been Sandra's close friends since before Gerald, who regarded Kezia's entrance the way cats regard unexpected movement, with careful, assessing stillness. Her father found her in the front hallway before she'd made it 5 steps inside. Gerald Thornton was 72 years old, and had the look of a man who had spent a great many years making peace with things he couldn't change and hadn't quite finished. He looked at Kezia with an expression that collapsed several years of absence into a single moment. And then he embraced her. Properly. Fully. The kind of embrace that carries an apology in it even when the word itself doesn't come. She let him hold on. She held him back. When they separated, Gerald looked at Wu Jin and extended his hand. Wu Jin shook it with the quiet, unhurried confidence that Kezia had always found one of his most recognizable qualities. He never tried to fill a room, but rooms arranged themselves around him anyway. Gerald said he was glad they'd come. The words were simple, worn at the edges with what they actually meant. Wu Jin said it was good to finally meet him. Kezia watched her father absorb that finally, the weight of all it implied, the years contained in it, and saw something shift slightly in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. Something older and more complicated than guilt. Sandra found them near the dining room 20 minutes later. She was dressed beautifully. She was always dressed beautifully. 70 looked good on her in the way it looks good on people who have arranged their lives with great care and significant resources. She was holding a glass of champagne and wearing a smile Kezia had catalogued in childhood, the public smile, the one with teeth, the one that said she was performing for an audience. What a surprise. What a delight. Sandra's voice carried that particular melody, warm and rounded, the one she deployed for guests she needed to impress. She was so glad Kezia had made it. The house had missed her. All of it delivered without any visible awareness of the irony, or perhaps with complete awareness of it, which was a different thing entirely. Kezia said happy birthday. Sandra's gaze moved to Wu Jin with the particular attention of a woman accustomed to evaluating people quickly. She introduced herself. He told her his name. A small pause followed. The kind of pause that happens when someone is running a search and the results come back unexpected. Sandra asked, with her champagne smile perfectly in place, how they knew each other. Kezia said that Wu Jin was her husband. The pause that followed was fractionally longer than the one before it. Sandra said, of course, she had heard about the wedding, and how lovely. The champagne smile did not waver, but something behind it went very still. Kezia had spent 14 years studying that face. She knew exactly what very still looked like on it. Wu Jin said it was a pleasure to meet her, with the precise courtesy that isn't warmth, appropriate, creating no more connection than the situation required. He had an excellent instinct for this. She'd always admired it. Sandra excused herself to attend to other guests. They watched her cross the room. There was a rigidity in her spine that hadn't been there before she'd found them. Kezia picked up a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray. She was entirely calm. This, she thought, was what it felt like to walk into a room with nothing to prove. It felt like standing on solid ground. Marcus Whitmore found her at the edge of the living room, while Wu Jin was across the room in conversation with one of Gerald's oldest friends, a retired architect who had apparently read about one of Wu Jin's company's urban development projects and wanted to discuss it in depth. Marcus was 37 now. The particular self-assurance of the favored child had softened somewhat with age. He'd had 2 businesses since the engagement fell apart, one moderate success and one quiet failure, and the years had done what years tend to do. Complicated him. He looked at Kezia with an expression that was harder to read than the contempt she remembered from 2012. There was something else in it now. Something that might have been, if she was reading it right, the specific discomfort of a man who has been carrying something that doesn't quite sit right. Marcus. Her own name back at him a beat later. A brief exchange that managed to carry 12 years of unopened mail in 4 syllables. He noted that she looked well. She thanked him. A silence opened between them. The particular kind that only exists between people who share a history that has never been spoken out loud, and both of them know it. Then, without quite meeting her eyes, Marcus mentioned that he'd done some reading. Her husband, real estate, tech investment, the Yoon Group. He'd looked it up. Kezia waited. There was a commercial project, Marcus continued. Mixed-use development on the north side. Preliminary stages. Nothing confirmed yet. And he was wondering whether a conversation might be possible. With her husband, if she thought he'd be open to it. There it was. She looked at him for a moment. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of clear-eyed tiredness at the predictability of it. 12 years of silence, and the first personal conversation they had was a pitch. She told him she would mention it, but she wanted to be clear that Wu Jin's schedule was his own, and that she was not a door Marcus could walk through to reach him. That was the extent of what she could offer. Marcus nodded, and then, in a movement that seemed to cost him something, he looked directly at her and began a sentence he didn't finish. That there were things he should have, that it had been a long time, and that things looked different now than they had then. He didn't say the word sorry, but the sentence hung between them, unfinished, and Kezia understood it for what it was. The first crack in 12 years of not looking at something directly. She told him she knew, and that they could talk about it sometime. Not here, not tonight, not with his mother 20 feet away making her rounds with the champagne smile. He nodded once more and moved away. Kezia watched him go and felt nothing dramatic. Just the quiet, complicated awareness that people are rarely only one thing, and that the people who hurt you are sometimes also the people who eventually figure out that they did. The moment arrived the way those moments tend to arrive. Not announced, not dramatic in its setup, just suddenly there. Kezia had stepped into the kitchen to get a glass of water when she heard a voice behind her that she hadn't heard speak directly to her in over a decade. Sandra's older sister, Carol. the woman who had sat at Sandra's right hand at every family gathering Kezia could remember, who had always carried Sandra's opinions about Kezia with the particular enthusiasm of someone who liked to have enemies borrowed from someone more interesting than herself. Carol was 73 and had the bearing of a woman who had always believed herself to be far more important than the evidence supported. She looked at Kezia with an expression that took a slow inventory of her, of the dress, the ease with which she stood, the absence of anything that looked like defeat. And then Carol's mouth curved into something that was technically a smile. New York. Carol had heard she was living there. Must be tough, that city. The word tough landed with a specific weight, placed there deliberately, allowed to sit. Carol tilted her head in the way of people who want you to know they're remembering something they think wounds you, that it must have been hard, going out there alone the way Kezia had, after everything that had happened. The smirk arrived then, carrying everything Carol meant. Looks like life finally punished you for it. The kitchen smelled of catered food, and the particular floral detergent Sandra had always used on the linens, which was one of those involuntary memory triggers Kezia had learned to navigate over the years. Smell, more than almost anything, could pull you back into the body of a younger self. 14-year-old Kezia, standing at the same counter trying to be small enough to avoid notice. She was not that girl. She knew that. But the kitchen knew her as that girl, and being in it required a small, deliberate act of orientation. She had expected, coming back here, that some of the old reflexes would still be live, that some combination of the place and the people would access the girl who'd once needed this household's approval so desperately that its withdrawal had felt like drowning. Instead, she felt something that took her a moment to identify: the absence of the wound. Like reaching for a sore spot and finding it healed over. Not gone. The scar tissue was real, and she knew its shape, but no longer open, no longer capable of being pried. She was standing at her own center. Nobody in this house could move her off it. She opened her mouth to respond. She didn't need to. Woo Jin walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, looking for her with the ease of a man who always knew where she was in a room, and stopped beside her in the particular way he had. Close, present, with no performance about it. He rested his hand lightly at the small of her back. Not possessive. Just there. He looked at Carol with a polite, measured expression and said he hoped he wasn't interrupting. Carol's smirk did something complicated. Her gaze moved to Woo Jin with the involuntary attention of someone who has just realized that the room has changed while they were talking. He had that quality, not because of any particular effort on his part, but because he was the kind of person who occupied space with a quiet certainty that was immediately legible to people who understood that kind of certainty. Kezia introduced him. She said, "This is my husband, Woo Jin Yoon." She watched Carol's expression go through its rapid recalculations. She watched the moment where Carol ran through what she knew about the name and came back with results she had not anticipated. Woo Jin Yoon, the Yoon Group, the investment portfolio, the company he'd built that had appeared in the journal twice in the last year alone. Carol said it was very nice to meet him. Woo Jin said likewise, with the precise courtesy that wasn't warmth. There was a pause in which several things went unsaid at remarkable speed. Then Carol mentioned something about the other guests and excused herself. When she was gone, Woo Jin glanced at Kezia with one eyebrow very slightly raised. She knew that expression. It said, "Do you want to tell me? Or should I guess?" She told him, very quietly, leaning against the kitchen counter the way she used to lean against the counter in this kitchen at 14, except now it was entirely different. She told him what Carol had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She said that to you in the kitchen of your father's house at a birthday party." Kezia said yes. He looked out at the party beyond the kitchen doorway. He said, thoughtfully, that life had an interesting sense of timing. She laughed, actually laughed, fully, for the first time all evening. He looked back at her, and she could see in his face the thing that still sometimes arrested her even after 6 years, the way he looked at her, like she was the clearest thing in whatever room they were in. Carol's smirk had been wrong about the direction of the punishment. Life had not punished Kezia Thornton. Life had, in the patient and non-linear way it does things, given her exactly what she had worked for and hoped for, and, in the hardest years, barely believed in. She had gotten here by being exactly who she was, relentlessly, in the face of every effort to define her as something less. That was all. That was everything. They sat down to dinner at 9. Gerald had arranged the seating and had, with what Kezia chose to believe was intentional diplomacy, placed her and Woo Jin near him, at the far end of the table from Sandra and Carol. Diane was there, 35 now, with the guarded expression of a woman who had spent her adult life being Sandra's daughter and was beginning, perhaps, to have complicated feelings about what that meant. She did not approach Kezia during the evening, but twice Kezia caught her looking, and both times Diane looked away first. Woo Jin talked to Gerald about Chicago's architectural evolution, which was a subject Kezia knew could engage her father for hours. She watched them and felt something loosen in her chest, the two of them finding their way toward each other across the table, her father leaning forward with the first real animation she'd seen in him all evening. Her husband listening and then asking exactly the right follow-up question. He had a gift for that. For finding the thing someone actually wanted to talk about and giving them room to talk about it. Across the table, she was aware of Sandra watching this exchange. Sandra's expression was its customary composed surface, but Kezia understood by now the difference between Sandra's genuine ease and Sandra's managed composure. This was the latter. Sandra had spent 40 years in every room she walked into reading it. She was reading this one now, and what she was reading was not what she had expected to find. After dinner, while people moved to the living room for cake and champagne toasts, Sandra found a quiet moment to approach Kezia near the window. She said, in the low, private tone that Kezia associated with the conversations Sandra had when she wanted the audience to be small, that she hoped Kezia understood that what had happened all those years ago, and she paused there, leaving all those years ago to do the heavy lifting of vagueness, had been very painful for everyone. Kezia said she was sure it had been. Sandra said she hoped they could move past it. For Gerald's sake. For the family. Kezia looked at her for a long moment. She thought about 22-year-old Kezia, standing in this living room being asked if a lie was true. She thought about how much energy she had once spent hoping that Sandra would someday acknowledge what she'd done. Not even apologize. Just acknowledge. She thought about how she had finally stopped spending that energy, because some doors are locked from the inside by the person who is in the wrong, and you cannot open them from the outside no matter how long you stand there. She told Sandra that she was here for her father. She said she wished her a happy birthday. She said those things with perfect composure and perfect sincerity, because she meant both of them. And then she moved away from the window toward the part of the room where her father and her husband were laughing together at something, and she chose, deliberately and completely, to walk toward that. The cake was cut. The toasts were made. The guests began filtering out in the way party guests do, slowly at first, then in a rush. By 11 o'clock, the house had reduced to family and the very closest of Sandra's friends. And by 11:30, Kezia and Woo Jin were preparing to leave. Her father walked them to the door. He shook Woo Jin's hand first. He held it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and looked at him with the expression of a man communicating something he didn't quite have the words for. Woo Jin received it with the same quiet openness with which he received most things. He told Gerald that Kezia talked about him. He said it simply, just that. Gerald turned to Kezia. The hallway was quiet. Through the doorway to the living room they could hear the muffled conversation of the remaining guests, and under it the sounds of the house, the particular creaks and settled silences of a place that had been lived in for a very long time. Gerald said her name. Then, without preamble, without softening language, in the direct way of a man who has rehearsed something so many times that the performance has finally burned away, leaving only the thing itself, he told her that he owed her something he should have said a long time ago. He hadn't believed the right person. That was the center of it, the weight of it, and he didn't dress it up. He had known, somewhere, Somewhere he'd kept very quiet for a very long time, that what Sandra had said didn't add up, that the girl he'd raised wasn't capable of what she'd described. He had chosen the easier belief because he was tired and grieving and had built something new that he hadn't wanted to put at risk. All of this he put into words carefully, slowly, with the particular pain of a man setting down something heavy and knowing that the setting down now doesn't undo how long he carried it. Sorry. The word arrived without decoration, not a reflexive sorry, not the sorry that means please let this be over, but the specific, weary, honest sorry of a man who was accounting for something. Kezia stood very still. She had imagined this conversation hundreds of times. In the imagination, it was sometimes cathartic, and sometimes devastating, and sometimes it didn't land the way she needed it to. Standing here now, in the actual version of it, what she felt was not the rush of resolution she'd sometimes hoped for. It was something quieter and more honest than that. It was the feeling of being seen, finally, by someone who had failed to see her, and understanding that the seeing, even late, even inadequate, was still something real. She knew. She had always known he wasn't a cruel man. That was the thing she'd had to hold on to in the years when it would have been easier to let go of it. She said those things because they were true, and because he needed to hear them, and because she had decided a long time ago that she was not going to let what Sandra had done make her someone who withheld true things from people who needed them. Then she stepped forward and held her father, the way she used to hold him when she was 12 and the world had just stopped making sense. And he held her back, with the particular desperation of a man who has been at a distance for a very long time and is finally, closing it. Woojin stood quietly in the hallway and looked at the wall and gave them the moment without commentary. He was very good at that. They drove back to the hotel in silence for the first few minutes. Chicago at midnight had that particular quality of big cities at rest, still busy, still lit, but with a depth under it that isn't there during the day. The lake was somewhere to the east, invisible but felt. Woojin drove with one hand on the wheel and the easy posture of a man who is comfortable with silence. He didn't ask her how she was feeling. He knew how she was feeling. He was waiting to see if she wanted to talk about how she was feeling, which was different. She stared out at the city for a few blocks. Then she said that her father had apologized. Woojin said he knew. He said he'd been close enough to the doorway to hear it. She asked if he thought it was enough. He thought about this genuinely, which was one of the things she loved about him. He didn't answer the difficult questions reflexively. Something, he offered finally. What he was sure of was that enough was hers to decide, not his, and that the deciding didn't have to happen tonight. She turned that over. She thought about the apology, and about Sandra's face when she'd met Woojin, and about Carol's smirk and its rapid dismantling, and about Marcus's unfinished sentence, and about her father's voice saying I didn't believe the right person. She was going to be okay. She was already okay. She told him so. He glanced at her at a red light. A look she knew well. Steady and without ceremony. Never any doubt about that, he told her. Not once. She looked at him. At the profile she knew better than almost anything. The specific quality of attention he brought to whatever he was focused on. The way he had stood beside her tonight without ever trying to stand in front of her. Without making himself the story when she was the story. 6 years of this man and she still felt, regularly, the quiet astonishment of having found him. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on the console. He turned his palm up to hold hers. The light changed. He drove. 3 weeks after the party, Kezia got a text from a number she didn't recognize at first. She almost didn't read it. Then she saw the name at the top of the thread that her phone had associated with the number. Gerald had put Diane's contact in her phone years ago, at some family gathering she barely remembered, and it had sat there ever since like a message in a bottle that had never been opened. The text said, I know this is late, and it said, I knew the screenshots weren't real, and then, I'm sorry I didn't say so. 6 words across 3 messages, from Diane, who was 35 and had apparently spent some time since the party with whatever had been sitting with her for 12 years. Kezia sat with it for a long time. She thought about Diane at 15, sharp and competitive, and entirely under her mother's orbit. She thought about what it cost, or didn't cost, a 15-year-old to let a lie stand when the lie served her family's alignment. She thought about what it cost a 35-year-old to text that same truth to the woman it had wronged, knowing that it wouldn't fix anything, and also that the not fixing didn't make the saying worthless. She texted back 3 words. "Thank you, Diane." She showed it to Woo Jin that evening. He read it without comment for a moment, then offered that this was what accountability looked like when it arrived late and from an uncomfortable place. That Kezia had more grace than most people. She wasn't sure about that. What she knew was that she had been living her life long enough that the old wounds had scar tissue over them now, and that made it possible to receive something like Diane's text without needing it to be more than it was. "Grace," he said quietly, the word landing as a statement of fact, not a compliment, the way he said the things he meant most. The following spring, Gerald Thornton flew to New York for a long weekend. He stayed at a hotel near their apartment because Kezia had insisted on it. Not out of distance, but out of consideration, because she had learned that proximity and intimacy were separate things, and that rebuilding something required space to do it in properly. They had dinner 3 times. They walked along the High Line on a Saturday afternoon that was cold and bright. The way New York in April sometimes is. Winter not entirely finished, spring insisting anyway. Gerald walked with a slight stiffness in his left hip that hadn't been there the last time she'd seen him in movement, and she noted it the way she noted these things now, with attention, without alarm, filing it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she planned to be present for. They talked about her mother on the second night, over dinner at the Italian restaurant near the apartment that had become, in the way of city restaurants, almost an extension of their home. Gerald talked about Adaze in a way he never had when Kezia was growing up. Not around the edges of her, but directly, with the specificity that comes when someone finally gives themselves permission to remember. He talked about how she laughed, about a road trip they'd taken the first year they were together, about the way she'd had of making any room feel settled just by being in it. Kezia listened and asked questions. She wanted all of it, every memory he'd been carrying alone because he hadn't had anyone to carry them with. At one point he looked at her and said, "She would have loved Woo Jin." Kezia said she knew. Gerald said, "And she would have been so proud of you." Not because of any of the external things. He gestured vaguely, meaning the career, the life, the evident stability and success of it. He said, "Because of who you are. She always said you were going to be someone remarkable." Kezia looked at her wine glass. She was 34 years old, and she had built something solid from a very difficult foundation, and she had, over years and with effort, and with the help of a man who knew how to love her without diminishing her, found her way back to herself. But she was still her mother's daughter. Some things stayed tender. I know. She held those 2 words for a moment before giving them back. And then, she told me. She told me every day. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Gerald understood that she was not speaking only of her mother's pride. She was speaking of the whole of it. The voice she'd carried. The belief she'd inherited from a woman who had loved her completely, and then left before she had any say in it. The thing Kezia had spent 22 years being careful not to put down, even when everything around her made it heavy to hold. Her father reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He didn't speak. Neither did she. Outside, New York moved past the restaurant windows in its usual indifferent rush. And inside, something that had been broken for a very long time quietly, finally, began to mend. Life doesn't resolve the way stories are supposed to. Carol sent a brief, pleasant note after the birthday party, the kind of note that says nothing specific and means nothing specific. And Kezia replied with the same careful neutrality, and that was what it was. A transaction. 2 women who had said everything they were going to say to each other, at least everything that counted, and had agreed without discussion to leave it at that. Sandra did not call, did not write, did not find her way to any acknowledgement. Which was exactly what Kezia had expected, and which mattered exactly as much to her as she'd decided to let it matter. Sandra was a woman who had built her whole self on the premise that she was right about everything. And people who build themselves that way do not dismantle the architecture because of one evening. Kezia had accepted this not with bitterness, but with the particular equanimity that comes from having finally stopped waiting for something. She had waited, for years, for Sandra to become a person who could do what Gerald and Diane had done. She had waited for some crack in the surface through which an acknowledgement might slip. She had eventually understood that the waiting was its own kind of trap, that she was spending real energy on a door that was locked from the inside, by a person who had no intention of opening it. The day she stopped waiting was not dramatic. She was on the subway, going somewhere she didn't remember, and the thought arrived clearly. I am done giving this person my time. She'd looked out the window at the dark walls of the tunnel rushing past and felt, with quiet surprise, that she meant it. Marcus was more complicated, because Marcus had started to crack. 6 weeks after the birthday party, he sent an email, not a text, an email, which told her he had drafted and deleted and redrafted something that mattered to him. It was 2 paragraphs long. The first addressed the development project, professionally, appropriately, asking if she'd had a chance to pass along his information. The second paragraph was something else. It said that he'd been thinking about what he'd started to say at the party and hadn't finished. It said that he'd known, even at 25, that the story his mother told didn't fully add up, and that he'd chosen not to look at that too closely, because looking at it closely would have meant looking at his mother closely, and he hadn't been ready to do that. It said he was sorry. The word was there, in the second paragraph, plain and unadorned. Kezia read it twice. Then she forwarded the project inquiry to Woo Jin's assistant, because she had said she would, and she was a person who kept her word even when she didn't owe it. Then she wrote Marcus back. 1 paragraph, 5 sentences. She appreciated him saying it. That came first, because it was true. It mattered. She wasn't ready to build something from it yet, but the door wasn't closed either, and sometimes that was enough of a start. She signed her name and sent it before she could think herself into either more or less generosity than that. She didn't know what would come of it. She didn't need to know yet. Some things were allowed to simply be open, without resolution, without a declared outcome. Life had taught her that not everything needed to be decided today, that some threads were worth holding without pulling, that patience wasn't the same thing as passivity. She was good at waiting when waiting was what the moment called for. She'd had a lot of practice. Her father called every Sunday, not always for long, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, but with the consistency of someone who has decided to show up and means it. They talked about ordinary things, the weather in Chicago, a building he was consulting on in retirement, a book she'd recommended that he'd actually read. Occasionally they talked about her mother, and those conversations had a tenderness in them that felt new and irreplaceable, like learning a language you were always meant to speak and had simply never been taught. Woo Jin and Gerald had developed, without any particular announcement, something that resembled an independent rapport. They texted occasionally about architecture, about a documentary Gerald had watched and wanted a second opinion on. Once, Woo Jin had called Gerald to ask his thoughts on the structural design of a mixed-use building his firm was consulting on, a genuine question, not a courtesy. And Gerald had spent 40 minutes on the phone, talking about load distribution and material integrity with the energy of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask. Kezia had listened from the other room, and felt a warmth so particular and so specific that she hadn't had a word for it until it arrived. Wholeness. The feeling of the separate pieces of a life coming into contact with one another. On a Sunday evening in December 2024, Kezia sat curled at one end of the couch in their apartment with a book she wasn't quite reading, watching the city lights reflect off the windows and listening to Woo Jin in the kitchen doing something that smelled like the Korean stew he made when the weather turned cold, the one with the fermented kimchi that had been his grandmother's recipe and that she had asked him to teach her and not yet gotten around to learning properly. She was going to learn it. She'd decided that recently, the way you decide small things that are actually large things, quietly, privately, with a kind of certainty that doesn't need to be announced. She thought about the evening in October. She thought about Carol's smirk and the moment it had dismantled. She thought about her father in the hallway, about the specific quality of his voice when he said, "I didn't believe the right person." Not performative, not seeking absolution, just honest, the way only old grief can be honest. She thought about Diane's 3 messages arriving out of nowhere like a letter finally delivered after 12 years in transit. She thought about Marcus's 2nd paragraph. She thought about her mother, who had told her, in the voice Kezia still heard, would always hear, 22 years on, that she was brilliant and worthy, and that the world would eventually recognize it. Adais Thornton had been right. She had been right about all of it. The world had taken its time. It had been circuitous and unjust, and occasionally cruel in the particular way the world is cruel when it lets lies go unchallenged for too long. It had required Kezia to build herself from scratch, twice, in 2 different cities, without the scaffolding that should have been there. It had asked of her a resilience she had not chosen, and a patience she had not volunteered for. But here she was. Wu Jin appeared in the kitchen doorway, wooden spoon in hand, telling her 20 minutes. She looked up at him. This man who had walked into her life in an elevator and held the door and changed everything by saying one dry, accurate thing about lobby art, and felt what she always felt when she looked at him. Not performance, not dazzle. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Certainty. The specific, unshakable feeling of standing on ground that holds. She set her book down. She went to the kitchen to be near him, the way she always ended up near him, the way she had understood from that first afternoon. 4 hours of coffee going cold, a missed train she hadn't cared about at all, that this was where she was supposed to be. She didn't think about Carol. She didn't think about Sandra. She didn't spend a single breath on the smirk that had been so confident and so completely wrong about what life had done to Kezia Thornton. She stood in her kitchen, in her apartment, in her city, in her life, and she let herself be, fully and without apology, exactly who she was and exactly where she was. That was the thing about solid ground. Once you found it, you stopped noticing it. It was just there, steady beneath you, holding your weight without complaint, asking nothing of you except that you live. She lived. If this story moved you, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone else's lie, or walked back into a room full of people who wrote you off and came out the other side, drop a comment and let me know. I want to hear from you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, the next story is coming, and you don't want to miss it.